The first European to taste chocolate spat it out and called it bitter water fit for pigs. Look, that is not poetry. That comes from an actual colonial record. And it makes everything that happened next kind of baffling. Because within 150 years of that reaction, chocolate was being drunk from silver pots in French palaces. It was being prescribed by physicians for tuberculosis and depression. It was, the subject of serious church debate. Actual councils of bishops sitting down to determine whether drinking it counted as breaking a religious fast. And eventually, it was being dispensed from a pharmacy counter inside a covered shopping arcade in Brussels by a man who just wanted to make his medicine go down easier. This video is the full story of how that happened. We're starting with cacao rituals in the ancient Maya world, a civilization that wrote this plant directly into their creation mythology and buried it alongside their dead, and working forward through Aztec tribute systems, Spanish conquest, and a cascade of Dutch and Swiss and British industrial inventions, all the way to a moment in 1912, when a pharmacist's grandson in Brussels replaced a medicinal filling with sweetened cream and accidentally invented the Belgian praline. The arc spans about 4,000 years and at least 3 major civilizations, and almost none of it looks anything like what you find in a candy aisle today. The thing most people get wrong about chocolate is not some small detail buried in the footnotes. It is the entire substance. For most of its history, chocolate was bitter, unsweetened, cold, and explicitly sacred. It was not a treat. It was not a gift. It was a ritual object. Understanding that, really sitting with what that actually means, changes everything about what chocolate eventually became, and why it is the way it is now. If tracing what we eat today all the way back through 4,000 years of ritual, conquest, and accidental pharmacology sounds like your kind of video, there's a lot more where this came from on this channel. Subscribing means you don't miss the next one. And if you already know something about this story that you think I've gotten wrong or skipped over, put it in the comments. I read all of them. Before chocolate was something you ate, and before it was even something you drank in any form you'd recognize, the whole story turned on a choice that almost no one makes today. The earliest people to use the cacao plant were not, interested in the seed. They were after the fruit. The cacao tree, Theobroma cacao, a tropical species that grows in the humid equatorial lowlands of South America, produces a large, roughly football-shaped pod. Inside that pod, wrapped tightly around each seed, is a white, sweet, mucilaginous pulp. That pulp ferments naturally. It's the beginning of the transformation. And the oldest confirmed evidence for human use of cacao, theobromine residues extracted from ceramic vessels at Puerto Escondido in the Ulua Valley of what is now Honduras, dated to before 1000 BCE, does not describe anything like chocolate. It describes a fermented fruit drink, something closer to a mildly alcoholic beverage than anything we'd think of as confectionery. This reframes the entire origin story. The seed, the source of every single piece of chocolate ever made in the modern world, was not the original point. Humans came for the pulp. Only gradually, over what appears to have been centuries of cultivation and careful observation, did people begin processing the bitter seeds themselves. The exact steps of that transition are still not fully understood. What we do know is that by the time the Olmec civilization was at its height on Mexico's Gulf Coast, cacao had already moved far beyond its original purpose. It had become something sacred. And the chemistry buried in ancient pottery proves it. The Olmec left almost no written records. Their language has never been deciphered. But they left chemistry. And what that chemistry reveals, sitting inside the residue of ancient ceramic vessels, is, genuinely startling if you think about it for a second. Theobromine residues in pottery from San Lorenzo, one of the major Olmec ceremonial centers, confirm continuous cacao use. But what makes one specific finding so remarkable isn't the age, it's the context. One vessel was recovered from an elite burial site associated with sacrificial ritual. The cacao wasn't being stored, traded, or casually consumed. It was placed at a threshold between the living and the dead. That association Cacao at the intersection of life, death, and sacred authority was not a one-off. It echoes through every major civilization that subsequently encountered this plant. The Maya would write it onto monuments. The Aztec would give it to individuals chosen for sacrifice. And in a much later, much more commercialized form, it would become the thing you bring to a wedding or a funeral when you don't quite know what else to take. The specific social function keeps shifting. The underlying impulse, it stays the same. The civilization that developed cacao furthest, that built it into every layer of political, religious, and economic life, was the ancient Maya. And the single most important thing to understand about Maya chocolate is what it definitively, completely was not. By the classic Maya period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, cacao was woven into the full fabric of elite Maya life. It was inscribed in hieroglyphs on ceramic drinking vessels. Those vessels were named for their royal owners and placed in tombs as grave goods. The beverage they contained was made from fermented and processed cacao seeds, ground fine and mixed with water, maize, chili pepper, vanilla, and achiote, a red colorant derived from the annatto tree. The preparation was poured from one vessel to another at height, deliberately generating foam on the surface. And here's the thing. That foam was considered the most valued element of the entire drink, not the chocolate itself. The foam. The Quiché Maya creation text, the Popol Vuh, places cacao among the sacred foods from which the gods formed human beings. This was not decorative mythology. Cacao was embedded in Maya cosmology at its foundational level, which is also why Maya farmers treated it with a kind of reverence that their whole agricultural system made materially real. Cacao trees require shade, humidity, and equatorial warmth. Maya farmers planted them in the understory of taller trees, in the kind of diversified agroforestry arrangement that modern ecologists now recognize as genuinely sustainable, which is sort of embarrassing for us, given what we eventually did to it industrially. The trees took years to mature. They required knowledge passed between generations. And because all of that labor carried real economic weight, cacao also moved through Maya society as a tributary commodity. Conquered regions paid their political obligations in cacao beans, which flowed into the storehouses of major cities. So cacao was simultaneously a cosmological substance, a unit of economic value, and an agricultural commitment measured in years. The cup in front of the king represented all three things at once, and it was entirely, utterly bitter. No sugar. Spiced rather than sweetened. The connection between chocolate and sweetness, which feels so natural now that most people assume it's just inherent to the substance, is a European invention, and not an ancient one. The Aztec Empire inherited all of this, and then did what empires tend to do with valuable inherited systems. They scaled it up, codified it, and turned it into an instrument of political control. In the markets of Tenochtitlan, one cacao bean could purchase a tamale. 100 beans could get you a good turkey hen. These weren't rough approximations. These were administered exchange rates in an empire-wide monetary system. Cacao functioned as commodity currency alongside cotton cloaks and other standardized units of value, and the pocheca, long-distance merchants operating under direct state supervision, transported it from the tropical lowland zones where the tree actually grows into the high-altitude valley of Mexico, where it absolutely cannot. Every cup of Aztec xocóatl had travelled a very long way before it reached anyone's lips. Moctezuma II reportedly consumed the drink in large quantities from golden cups, though those accounts come from Spanish colonial records, written by men observing a culture they didn't understand through assumptions they couldn't set aside. What the independent archaeological and documentary evidence confirms is that cacao held a position in Aztec political theology that made it both an economic necessity and a ritual requirement. The god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was associated in Aztec tradition with the original gift of cacao to humanity. Individuals chosen for sacrifice were given cacao beverages beforehand. Cacao was placed in royal tombs. Conquered regions in the lowland zones paid their imperial tribute in cacao beans, and those beans were redistributed through Aztec storehouses and administered supply chains. To control the cacao supply was, to control something close to the sacred itself. The Aztec preparation had evolved from the Maya version. Colonial sources describe a cold beverage rather than a hot one, made from ground cacao and maize with vanilla and chili, poured vessel to build that prized froth. Bitter, aromatic, completely unsweetened. And by every account that survived, nothing a 16th century Spaniard was going to enjoy on first encounter. Which is exactly what happened. Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, and the Spanish response to Aztec chocolate is one of the more instructive moments in the history of cultural contact. The phrase "bitter water fit for pigs" comes from colonial records dating to the 1520s. It's one of the more candid things Spanish observers wrote about anything they encountered in Mesoamerica, in the sense that it captures a real first reaction rather than a dispatch designed to impress the crown. They did not enjoy xocóatl. Not at first, but they didn't leave, and they started adjusting the recipe. Chili came out, old world honey went in, and then cane sugar. Vanilla stayed. The drink was served hot. Cinnamon was added, then sometimes anise. The result? Sweet, warm, thick, heavily aromatic, was something completely different from what Moctezuma's court had been drinking. And the Spanish aristocracy, and then the Spanish church, went completely mad for it. The church debate that followed was, stranger than you might expect. Formal theological councils convened to determine whether drinking chocolate broke the Eucharistic fast. The concern was that it was too nutritious to qualify simply as a drink. By the late 17th century, the debate had largely resolved in chocolate's favour, which cleared the way for widespread consumption among clergy and laypeople alike. Medical practitioners working within the humoral framework that dominated European medicine until the 18th century attributed to chocolate nutritious, restorative, and even aphrodisiac properties. It was considered medicine. It was prescribed. It was, in some circles, considered genuinely therapeutic. The speed of the broader cultural reversal is still remarkable. Within a century of that disgusted first taste, chocolate had moved from Mexico to Madrid and was an established luxury. By the mid-17th century, chocolate houses had opened across Europe. The first London chocolate house opened in 1657, run by a Frenchman in Bishopsgate Street, who advertised an excellent West India drink. The marriage of the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa to Louis XIV of France in 1660 is the moment many histories identify as chocolate's entry into French court culture, carried not as a trade good, but as a personal royal habit by a queen who had grown up drinking it. Within a generation, it was embedded in Parisian intellectual life. This spread was inseparable from colonial extraction. By 1580, cacao plantations under Spanish control were already generating substantial colonial wealth, worked first through the coerced labour of indigenous populations under the encomienda system, and later through enslaved African labour as other European powers, England, France, Portugal, the Netherlands, entered the cacao trade, and extended cultivation to Brazil, the Caribbean, and eventually West Africa. The drink, being poured from silver pots in European salons, had a supply chain built on systems of compelled labour that the people holding those pots preferred not to think about. This is not a footnote to the history of chocolate. It is part of the history of chocolate. For almost 2 centuries after chocolate reached Europe, it stayed entirely liquid. The idea of eating chocolate, biting into it, carrying it in your pocket, wrapping it in foil, simply did not exist yet. Then, in the 1820s, in Amsterdam, something happened in a factory that changed everything. The Van Houten family, father Casparus and son Conrad Johannes, ran a chocolate factory in Amsterdam. In 1828, they patented a hydraulic press capable of expressing most of the fat from roasted ground cacao mass, leaving behind a dry cake that could be pulverized into a fine powder. Smoother, less bitter, and far more workable than anything that had come before. Conrad Van Houten then developed what became known as the Dutching process, treating the cocoa powder with potassium carbonate to reduce its natural acidity, darken the colour, and arrive at a milder flavour profile that European palates could actually work with. Between 1815 and 1828, the Van Houten factory transformed chocolate from a fatty, gritty, difficult beverage into a versatile industrial ingredient. They were solving a manufacturing problem. They had no idea they were changing food history. The next step came in 1847, when the British firm J.S. Fry & Sons figured out that by recombining separated cocoa solids, cocoa butter, and sugar in specific proportions, they could produce a moldable paste that set solid at room temperature. This was the first commercially manufactured eating chocolate in bar form. Chocolate, for the first time in 4,000 years of human history, was something you could hold in your hand and bite into without any preparation. That's a bigger deal than it sounds. Then the Swiss got involved. In 1875, Daniel Peter incorporated condensed milk, developed with help from his neighbour Henri Nestlé, into the chocolate mixture, producing the first milk chocolate, milder, sweeter, and broadly accessible to people who found dark chocolate's intensity too demanding. And then 4 years later, in 1879, Rudolf Lindt invented the conching process, prolonged mechanical agitation of liquid chocolate at carefully controlled temperatures, reducing particle size, driving off volatile acids, distributing cocoa butter evenly throughout the mass, and producing that smooth, glossy, melt-in-the-mouth texture that defines quality chocolate today. The snap when you break a good bar. The way it dissolves just below body temperature. All of that, all of it, comes from Lindt's conching machine. In under 60 years, chocolate had been compressed, dried, sweetened, solidified, flavoured with milk, and refined into something no ancient Mesoamerican would have recognised as descending from their sacred drink. The field was now completely open. The question was what someone would do with it next. And here is where Belgium enters the story. Not through a great master confectioner, not through an industrial factory, through a pharmacist in a covered shopping arcade in Brussels in 1857. I know that sounds like the setup to a joke. It isn't. Jean Neuhaus was Swiss-born, and he was not a chocolatier. He was an apothecary, a man who had, in fact, failed his medical studies, at least partly because he couldn't stand the sight of blood, who relocated to Brussels and opened his practice in the Galerie de la Reine, the Queen's Gallery, a covered shopping arcade in the centre of the city. His original use of chocolate was entirely medicinal. He coated medicines in chocolate to mask their unpleasant taste, a practice with deep roots in European pharmaceutical tradition. For centuries, chocolate had been used as a delivery vehicle for drugs. Neuhaus was applying an established solution to an established problem. 55 years passed. Then, in 1912, his grandson Jean Neuhaus II made one decision that changed the trajectory of Belgian chocolate entirely. He replaced the medicinal filling with sweetened cream. He took the hollow chocolate shell that had been designed to disguise something unpleasant and put something delicious inside it instead. He called the result a praline, borrowing a word that had previously referred to a sugar-coated almond. That original praline had been created in France in 1636 by a chef named Clément Lassagne, working for the Duc de Praslin, from whose title the word derives. What Neuhaus created was something categorically different from any of that. A hollow chocolate shell with a soft interior filling. That specific form, the shell, the resistance, the yielding softness behind it, was his invention, and his alone. 3 years later, in 1915, his wife, Louise Agostini, designed the ballotín, a rigid cardboard box with a fitted interior tray that held the praline in place without crushing them. That box became as globally iconic as what was inside it. If you've ever received Belgian chocolates as a gift, tied with ribbon, arranged in that perfect grid, you received something in a format invented in Brussels in the middle of the First World War by a pharmacist's wife who was trying to solve a transport problem. She was not designing an experience. She was just stopping praline from getting crushed in transit. But the experience she accidentally created, the unwrapping, the deliberate selection, the ceremony of the whole thing, turned out to matter enormously. and we'll come back to exactly why. The Neuhaus family's story explains the form of Belgian chocolate. It does not fully explain why Belgium specifically built a global reputation around fine chocolate. For that, you need one more structural piece, and it's the one that most gift boxes, understandably, don't mention on the label. From the early 20th century, Belgium's colonial presence in the Congo, established as King Leopold II's private domain in 1885 and transferred to the Belgian state in 1908 after the catastrophic human cost of Leopold's administration became impossible to ignore, gave Belgian chocolate manufacturers direct access to large quantities of West African cacao at a scale their competitors couldn't easily match. This is not a minor footnote. It was structurally decisive. That access allowed Belgian producers to extend chocolate's affordability progressively to the domestic working class, while simultaneously investing in the artisanal quality that would project Belgian chocolate into international premium markets. The luxury reputation and the mass market reach grew together from the same colonial supply advantage. The major Belgian houses that emerged from this period shaped what Belgian chocolate means internationally. Godiva, established by Pierre Draps in 1926, as the Chocolaterie Draps and later renamed, became one of the most recognized premium labels in the world. Leonidas, founded by a Greek confectioner named Leonidas Kestakides, who had attended the 1910 World's Fair in Brussels, won a bronze medal there for his confectionery, fell in love, settled in Belgium, and built a mass-market praline model that brought Belgian-style chocolate to consumers well outside the luxury tier. Two very different market positions. One underlying form, the hollow shell with a soft interior that Jean Neuhaus II had invented in a Brussels pharmacy in 1912. Today, Belgium has 13 chocolate manufacturers and shops per 100,000 inhabitants and is the second largest exporter of chocolate after Germany. A royal decree from 1894 established that Belgian chocolate must contain a minimum of 35% pure cocoa, specifically to prevent adulteration with low-quality fats, and that decree remains active today, integrated into European legislation. What began as a pharmacist's workaround for bad-tasting medicine has become a matter of national and supranational law. And what actually creates the flavour that distinguishes Belgian chocolate at the artisanal end? The answer doesn't start in Brussels. It starts in a fermentation shed thousands of miles away, under conditions that the ancient Maya would have found completely familiar. After cacao pods are harvested and the seeds are extracted, those seeds are heaped together and left to ferment, typically for 5 to 7 days, in a process driven by sequential activity of yeasts, lactic acid bacteria, and acetic acid bacteria. During fermentation, the seed's internal chemistry transforms. Sugars are metabolized, proteins are broken down, and the flavor precursors that will later develop during roasting are generated. The quality of that fermentation sets the ceiling for everything a chocolatier can subsequently achieve, regardless of their equipment or technique. You cannot conch your way out of bad fermentation. That is not a figure of speech. It's just true, and every serious chocolatier knows it. Premium Belgian chocolatiers at the artisanal end prioritize the Criollo bean, the same genetic lineage identified as the earliest domesticated cacao variety, selected by Mesoamerican cultivators roughly 3,600 years ago for its distinctive aromatic complexity. Criollo is more disease-susceptible, lower-yielding, and significantly more expensive than the commodity varieties that dominate global production. It makes up a tiny fraction of what's actually grown worldwide. The reason the best Belgian chocolate tastes the way it does is partly Van Houten's chemistry, partly Lindt's conching process, partly Neuhaus's praline form, and partly a return to the exact genetic decisions made by farmers whose names we don't know, working in tropical groves that no longer exist. The Maya prized the foam on their cacao because it concentrated the most aromatic compounds produced during preparation. Modern chocolatiers prize careful fermentation and Criollo genetics because they generate exactly the same underlying thing: flavor precursors, volatile aromatics, the biochemical complexity that separates chocolate with genuine character from chocolate that is merely sweet. 3,600 years of history, one tree. Same principle throughout. Which brings me to the question I kept coming back to throughout the research for this one. And I think it's the question that actually explains everything else. Why does every culture that has ever encountered this plant reach for it at the moments that matter most? In Aztec practice, cacao was given to individuals chosen for sacrifice before the ceremony. It was placed in royal tombs. It was consumed at births, marriages, and funerals, at every threshold where ordinary life crossed into something else. The Maya embedded it in creation mythology. The Olmec placed it with their dead. These are not the behaviors of a culture enjoying a pleasant beverage. These are the behaviors of a culture that recognized this specific substance as holding significance that exceeded ordinary categories. It was always, in every civilization that ever touched it, the thing people reached for when words weren't quite enough. That association did not disappear when chocolate crossed the Atlantic. It transformed. The elaborate Spanish court chocolate service, the silver pots, the porcelain cups, the ritual of preparation was a performance of access to something rarefied. London chocolate houses signalled intellectual seriousness and political relevance. The Belgian Praline and its ballotín signalled care, quality, and emotional investment in the person receiving it. And here's the part that genuinely gets me. Research in experimental psychology has shown that ritualistic behavior surrounding eating, the unwrapping, the arrangement, the deliberate act of selection, measurably enhances the perceived flavor and value of consumed chocolate. Louise Agostini's ballotín was not merely packaging. It was, without her knowing anything about neuroscience, an instrument for making the chocolate taste better, by making the act of receiving it more ceremonial. She figured out in 1915 what researchers would spend decades trying to quantify in controlled trials. Napoleon reportedly carried chocolate for himself and his senior officers during military campaigns, treating it as a cerebral restorative, a use that makes complete sense given the stimulant compounds in cacao, specifically theobromine and caffeine, which act on the central nervous system and have measurable effects on energy and alertness. The United States Army in 1937 commissioned Hershey to develop an emergency ration bar, the D-ration, engineered to provide 600 kilocalories, resist melting in extreme heat, and taste famously just a little better than a boiled potato. The Army deliberately engineered out the palatability. They had to make it actively unpleasant so that soldiers would not treat it as a snack and would leave it alone until they actually needed it. Even the military, in its most aggressively utilitarian application of this substance, ran headfirst into the same problem. Chocolate means something. And what it means kept interfering with every attempt to treat it as merely functional. Theobroma cacao, the food of the gods. A name assigned in 1753 by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, a man who had almost certainly never tasted xocóatl and had no idea what the Olmec had placed inside those burial vessels. But the name landed anyway, because it described something that had already been understood for millennia before he wrote it down. The bitterness the Spanish spat out, the foam the Maya valued above all else, the medicine filling a pharmacist's grandson replaced with cream. The ration bar an army had to make deliberately awful so that soldiers would stop reaching for it between emergencies. 4,000 years, one tree. Every civilization that has ever touched it has reached for it at the moments that mattered most.